In this lecture, we're going to talk about the structure of the plasma membrane that you find in cells. The plasma membrane is made of phospholipids, so that includes a phosphate molecule and a lipid, and you can see that it is stained red in these cells, so you can see what it looks like and where it's located on a cell. A phospholipid has two parts. So first there's the phosphate head. The phosphate head is polar, meaning that it's attracted to water. And another name for something that is attracted to water is hydrophilic. Philic means that it likes something, and hydro means water. So you can see the phosphate head in this diagram is here. And you can see it contains a phosphate molecule, and that's got the P in it, and that's how you know it contains phosphorus, which is part of a phosphate. Then this second part of a phospholipid is the lipid tails, and so those are shown over in this diagram as yellow, and they are made of two fatty acid chains. They are nonpolar, and nonpolar molecules repel water. They are hydrophobic. Phobias are things you're afraid of, so hydrophobic are things that don't like water. So both of those two things together make up the phospholipids, and there's two layers of phospholipids in a cell membrane, but all phospholipids contain that phosphate head and the lipid tails. When phospholipids come together to make a cell membrane, they make a lipid bilayer. The prefix bi means two, which means that this has two layers that make up the cell membrane. So you can see here's one layer of phospholipids, and then there's a second layer of phospholipids here. Those two layers together make up the phospholipid bilayer. The way it's structured is that the phosphate heads are always pointed to the outside of the cell, and you can see also that those lipid tails that are here in blue are always pointed towards the inside of the cell membrane. So the tails are always sandwiched between the phosphate heads in a phospholipid bilayer. These two layers surround the entire cell, so the cell is completely enclosed. It holds inside of it everything that needs to stay inside the cell so that it doesn't lose things like fluids and organelles. And so inside of the cell is a water-based solution, and outside of the cell is a water-based solution, but they don't touch each other because that phospholipid bilayer goes around the entire cell. The way that scientists describe the phospholipid bilayer is as the fluid mosaic model. And so it's made again of two layers, or a bilayer, and it's made of phospholipids. There are also other structures embedded in the cell membrane that include things like proteins. So you'll have, proteins that look like this, or proteins that look like this. There's lots of different types of proteins that can be found in the cell membrane. The membrane is described as fluid because the two layers are not directly attached to each other. They can slide past each other, and they're considered a mosaic model because the phospholipids are individual phospholipids, and they kind of are made of lots of little pieces, kind of like a mosaic tile. And anytime you have a model in biology, that's just a visual representation of how things are structured. But the phospholipids can move freely throughout the membrane, so they can trade places with each other without putting a hole in the membrane. There are certain characteristics that define how a phospholipid bilayer works. One of those characteristics is selective permeability. So this means that the phospholipid allows some materials to enter the cell, but not others. Sometimes this is called selective permeability, and it means that things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, small molecules that are nonpolar, some water molecules are able to go across the cell membrane without using energy. If it's a large molecule like glucose or really big proteins or ions that carry a charge, they are barred from going across the cell membrane unless they go through a protein. And because of this selective permeability, it allows the cell to maintain homeostasis because the cell membrane can determine what goes in and out. Embedded within those phospholipids, again, are some proteins. Proteins have lots of different jobs. Some of them are like protein channels. They allow things to travel through the cell membrane. There are other proteins that act as messengers. So perhaps if something binds to the surface of this protein, it can release a message on the inside of the cell. So that's another way that proteins are helpful. And they also act as markers and allow cells to identify what kind of cell they are. This diagram just shows how a protein is situated in the membrane. So you've got your phospholipid bilayer. So there's one layer here, one layer here. You can see those phosphate heads are on the outsides, and you can see that the lipid tails are on the inside. And then you've got this large protein. The protein has several regions. Typically, these proteins are structured so that there's a hydrophilic region at the ends of the protein where it sits with the phosphates, and a hydrophobic region where it rests next to the lipids of the phospholipid layer. Like I mentioned before, these proteins have specific jobs. So some of them are transport proteins. They help molecules move across the membrane. And so they help to get things from the inside to the outside of the cell, or from the outside to the inside of the cell. Again, some of these others are chemical signal molecules, and some are enzymes, meaning they help chemical reactions happen more quickly. Some are markers that allow you to determine if the cell belongs to your body or if it came from somewhere else, like it's a bacteria cell or something else. And some of them are also receptors. They bind to substances on the outside of the cell to cause changes on the inside of the cell.